Good afternoon. This is Steve Armstrong, the Social Studies Consultant for the state of Connecticut, and we welcome you to the third in our webinar series on the frameworks and on inquiry. And today, our inquiry, our discussion will be on continuing our discussion of the inquiry arc. We're going to do dimensions 2 and 3 today, which is really the heart of investigation of student work and investigating topics in the social studies. The format that we're going to have, we have 4 presenters today. And if you have comments or if you have questions or if you have suggestions, all I would ask you to do is write them in the chat box. John Tully is sitting close to me here, and John's going to be monitoring the chat box, and anything that you say or any questions you have, he will relay to the panelists. So anything you want to do, we're not doing the participants live with voice, but anything that you want to say or to repeat any comment that you want to make, simply put it into the chat box. All right, our presenters today on Dimensions 2 or 3 are Mary Hanna from the New Canaan Public Schools, Laura Kranicki from the Colchester Public Schools, Kate O'Mara from Regional District 17, and John Tully from Central Connecticut State University. So whoops, I'm sorry about that. We'll turn this over to them, and guys, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. This is Laura Kranicki. I'm going to give you the objectives. So on the next slide, participants can see what our objectives are for the webinar today. First of all, we are going to provide an overview of dimensions 2 and 3 of the frameworks. If you participated in the last framework webinar, then you know that dimension 1 was covered. We'll get more into that as we go through this webinar today. We'll also discuss how skills develop over time and across the grades. And then we're going to look at some specific examples of dimensions 2 and 3 in these 3 areas: elementary students across content and evaluating evidence, teaching American history with documents and images, and then looking at geography across grade levels. And we don't want to leave out the university and college work, so John Tully will speak on that. And then we'll be concluding our webinar today with looking at resources for applying Connecticut social studies framework. And next we'll have Kate with the next slide.
I got to go on. Am I on?
Go ahead, Kate.
Thank you. This is Kate O'Mara, and on this slide we have an overview of the inquiry arc. The inquiry arc is composed of 4 different dimensions, and you can see them listed here. The first one is asking questions and planning inquiries. These inquiries may be teacher created, or it can be very exciting when it's student created. The second part of the inquiry arc is applying disciplinary concepts and tools. And in this case, we focus on 4 disciplines specifically. Those disciplines are history, civics, geography, and economics. But that is not exclusive either. There are other disciplines, especially at the high school level, that may be incorporated, for example, like sociology or psychology. The third dimension is evaluating sources and using evidence. And this is really about looking how we learn about either geography or history or economics. It includes things like making sure we use multiple sources and evaluating those sources. And finally, the fourth part of the inquiry arc is communicating conclusions and taking informed action, which could be in our schools, or it could be at a contest like History Day, for example. And I'm going to pass it off now to Mary for the next slide.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome, everyone. This is Mary speaking now. And this slide just really shows us, oh, we could go to the next slide, please. This is going to show us a little bit about inquiry in our classrooms and our overarching question, which is really how can inquiry come alive in our classrooms? Those who are watching live, again, we welcome you to chat. There'll be a couple of places that you can stop, or we can stop as we're going. If you're not watching live, there are some places that the symbol denotes that we can pause and maybe you have a quick turn and talk with people that you're doing professional learning with. So we've tried to indicate those places and invite your participation. Thank you. Go to the next slide, please. So I can pick it up here and continue on. If we look at this slide, we have pulled some of the indicators under the civics in Dimension 2, and we can see how they progress over time and really build upon one another as students advance through the grades. So I thought this might be a great chance to apply some of this. So we're going to ask you to look through the indicators, perhaps find one indicator at a grade level with which you work, and in the chat box, please send in your thoughts on what this might look like in your classroom or the grade level you teach. So John's going to be monitoring our chat, and we'll see if we have anything come in. So we'll let that sort of keep going. And why don't we go to the next slide? We can take a look at Dimension 3, and perhaps people can consider also the sources. So we've got the indicators in Dimension 2. We still continue to think about civics. Maybe we can think together about what sources you might use. How would you help students evaluate the sources? If anyone has any experience with Dimensions 2 or 3 or ideas about this, what this might look like at your class, with your class or at your grade level, please feel free to go ahead and use that chat. We've got someone who said that they might have the students read the 13th Amendment and what it actually meant when slaves were free, and how to implement this rule. Somebody else has said that maybe a first-person account might be a source that they could use to show bias. Great. We're getting some comments in now. So one of the bias, someone was mentioning that for first-hand accounts do have that built-in bias that sometimes one person never sees the whole event. So you're only getting one person's account. So it's a good way to teach kids how to really evaluate the credibility of sources. Terrific. So we'll keep going. Feel free to just jump in and chat. If you're not watching this live, again, you might want to pause and have that discussion. Why don't we go to the next slide? So let's dive in a little bit further to Dimension 3 in evaluating the sources. Look here, these are some of the components of this. Students need to analyze information and come to conclusions. And some of the components are the well-reasoned explanations, evidence-based arguments, rigorous analysis of sources, and application of information. The next slide, please. All right, this is still Mary, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some examples that have been used in our school system at the elementary level. To start with Dimension 2, with the core 4 disciplines, we really ask our students to uniquely observe their world, and there's a shift from a language arts only view. Although we do ask students to read and write, of course speak and listen, we integrate literacy. There are some unique concepts in school, tools rather, within the 4 disciplines and they really ask us to help our students think and work a little bit differently than they may have done in the past. Students consider how a geographer might look at their world, or perhaps how a historian looks at their world. If you're working with depth of knowledge in your district, you'll find that it's really here in this dimension and dimension 3 that you're able to do some work at a deeper level with your students that really encourage the transfer of understanding. Students in the elementary school are really very eager to take on some of these authentic roles. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So thinking about evaluating sources and using evidence, and again, what that might look like in an elementary school, I'm going to give you a couple of examples about what this might look like. Typically at the elementary level, we might use all 4 disciplines woven into a unit, but often one takes the lead. These could easily be tweaked for different grade levels, and depending on how your district decides to implement the framework. You'll see up here an example of a unit within a unit. The big unit is about the town, and the mini inquiry is about parks in the town. So in this mini part, students are working with not only the essential or compelling question for the unit, what makes a town a good place to live, they've also identified a section of the unit that would be good for a mini inquiry. Go on to the next slide, please. So in this mini inquiry, students are launched into thinking about parks in our town. And we've done this the past couple of years, but there was actually a real issue in town this year about pop-up parks, which are parks that are put up for just a day or so at a time. And if you're not familiar with them, they will go down at the end of that day. So one of the issues was that merchants didn't really feel that they were asked, and they were taking away from some of their people coming into their stores. So the students really took a compelling question of how do parks meet the needs of their community, and they staged the question by having the children look and analyze pictures of different parks of different types from around the world. They used a visible thinking strategy, a see, think, wonder, and generated some of the supporting questions they would need for this part of the inquiry. And then diving into dimension 2, they really used their civic planner hat in the civics discipline, and supported by some geography and a little bit of history, change over time, as well as some economics. What might we need? What might we want? And they really wrestled with that question about how do parks meet the needs of our community. And to find sources for this, they did a needs assessment. They researched their town using a variety of sources and really included some parent interviews into this piece. And speaking and listening were really big parts of this. You can just see some of their work. And when we talked about the disciplines all supporting each other, you can see the children making maps and creating this to show their understanding. Go to the next slide, please. Again, thinking as geographers and civics planners, students work with partners in small groups, and they developed a plan for the park, as well as blueprints for specific features they wish to include in their park. We've had in the past the first selectman, and this year had the president of the Chamber of Commerce come and visit and talk to the children. They were able to present some of their ideas for future pop-up parks, and actually she's going to take them right to her committee as they plan moving forward. Next slide, please. Go back one, please. As students learn about our town and state, again, they make connections to real places in their lives, and they understand that being a geographer, historian, or a civic planner can happen close to home. It doesn't have to happen in some remote place. And I want to encourage you to think that our towns and cities have many, many valuable resources for students of all ages to really take on these active roles. Next slide, please.
Mary, just a quick question here. What was the compelling question for that
for that part of the inquiry is, yeah, what makes, let me go back to my question here. What makes a town, how do parks meet the needs of our community? This was one of the questions that one of the teams was using. What makes a good park? If we move on to this one, I wanted to show you some examples of grade 5 and how they're really thinking as historians. And our district really tried to switch away from a textbook approach to more inquiry. And we really tried to embed many of these mini inquiries within our units, especially in colonization and the American Revolution. And what you see here is just some of the artifacts from a unit or mini inquiry that we call CSI Roanoke. So a few years ago, students would just read about Roanoke and colonization, and we decided that there were many primary sources that we could use to bring this to life. Go to the next page, please. And this just shows an example of some of the different sources that we've used that are readily available to just change it up and to think about what happened at Roanoke in a different way. So the kids are problem solving, evaluating the credibility and reliability of sources, and putting that all together. If we would go to the next slide, please. Oh, and the last one is just to show how we took something with dimension 3, thinking about the credibility of sources and evaluating sources in grade 5. We've got our compelling questions there. And when you look, there's 2 paintings of the Boston Tea Party done at different periods in history. So what is a first-hand account? It's something that comes up. And then there is a first-hand account of the Boston Tea Party by participant Hughes. If you've heard of him, he's got some wonderful I guess, diary entries of what happened at the Boston Tea Party. And I think it really makes it come alive when kids are reading, diving into the source and understanding that as the tea is being thrown overboard, that there are colonists running and scooping up tea, putting them into their pockets and sort of running off so the tea was not all lost. And kids revel in those details, and it's a great way for the kids to really look critically at these sources. Thank you. I think I'm going to hand it off to Kate now and some U.S. history.
Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Oops. Thank you. Hi, this is Kate O'Mara, and I'm going to share with you a unit that I developed with my colleague, Greg Cumstone, who found many of the sources and had some really great ideas for this unit, in which we tapped Dimension 2 disciplines of both history and economics, and Dimension 3 using multiple sources and evaluating the point of view of sources. Next slide, please. When I think about the C3 and how it works in my classroom and in our district, I begin with the Common Core and the C3 frameworks. In this work, I'm a teacher and I'm adapting an older curriculum. So I'm looking to see how can I apply the Connecticut framework to my lessons. I begin by thinking about a guiding question or a compelling question that to me suggests really why is it important to study this unit. To figure that out, I begin by looking over the Connecticut frameworks and just kind of spending some time thinking about it. Next slide, please. And this is an example of how I take the content and apply Inquiry Dimension 2 to it. I'm using the Connecticut frameworks to identify my compelling question, which in this case is historical and economic. And I've got it in yellow here. I decided that for the Great Depression, we would evaluate government policies and programs designed to restore stability to the economy, such as monetary and fiscal policies. This became the compelling question, and in my, and for my 8th graders, I rephrased it for them to ask them, was Roosevelt right when he adopted Keynesian economic policy to combat the Great Depression? So I changed it slightly because I'm working with 8th graders with this particular topic. Okay, now, next slide. Thank you. As I thought about these two disciplines of history and economics, clearly for this particular unit on the Great Depression, my focus was going to be on economic decision making. How do people respond when they're forced to cut their budgets? And what is going to be the result of everybody cutting their budgets? My students talked about wants and needs and realized pretty soon that you're going to have to pare down the things that you want to buy so that you can focus on the things that you need to buy. Ultimately, another question is, how should a president, or rather should a president, attempt to affect a national economy? So when I started with this, I was looking at two pieces, the economic decision-making and the national economy. In addition, because of this compelling question, the history comments kind of rose to the top. The first one is change, continuity, and context. There is a change in economic policy going from laissez-faire to an increased government involvement and the use of a national debt in order to spur the economy. And there may be a continuity of democracy. The idea that some of our founding beliefs did remain strong through a pretty large national economic depression. When looking at the resources I have, I also found that perspectives is a strong idea in this dimension, looking at history. My teaching partner, Greg Comstone, found a series of letters from a variety of Americans. These letters were written to the Roosevelts, and they were explaining the problems that they were having. So those are the 4 areas that I'm connecting to in this discipline, these disciplines. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here is an example of the lesson progression, and actually you can see the lesson progression at the bottom right of your screen, just to show you how this works and how it actually becomes a unit. I generally focus a unit on a challenging reading, and in this case I used FDR's inaugural speech from 1933. We shortened the speech a little bit. We took excerpts of it. It still ended up being a lengthy document. We added definitions on the right-hand side of some of the words that I thought my students might struggle with. And I created a series of text-dependent questions so that after we read the speech, students would dive back into it for a second time and hopefully discuss with their friends questions like, what did FDR mean when he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself"? Other really great quotes from this document that I found students referring back to are, happiness lies not in the mere possession of money, but it lies in the joy of achievement. And another thing that Roosevelt said was, our greatest primary task is to put people to work. These quotes are especially in the front of my mind right now because I'm reading a whole bunch of essays that students wrote for this unit, and the students found that these quotes resonated, and they're using them to prove that Roosevelt was either right or wrong to adopt the New Deal. So it's fascinating and it's wonderful to see how students are using this source. Greg created a gallery walk of images and cartoons from the era. that students found really interesting to look at and to discuss. And we even used the bank run scene from the movie It's a Wonderful Life to discuss fractional banking and the banking crisis at the time. Next slide, please. The 4 dimensions, for me as a teacher, have helped me most with this dimension, dimension 3 here, because as I'm planning my units or my lessons, I'm reminded to include this. It's sad for me to say that often when I'm faced with a lot of material to cover, I might not do as good a job with dimension 3, but now I am, and I'm really quite happy. When looking at all of the resources that students were using for the Great Depression, we started to question who wrote this source or who created this source and why did they create this source? Who might have drawn a particular political cartoon, and when were these things said or written? And what's the point of view of the people? Next slide, please. In this way, students are doing research as historians, and they're using a variety of resources, and they're using economic thinking skills in order to evaluate Roosevelt's New Deal. In the end, they will write an argument essay on whether or not Roosevelt was right to change the role of government in our lives. For a closer look at the geography discipline, Laura Kranicki will speak next.
Thanks, Kate. On the next slide, yes.
Before we move into your section, could we maybe just give 30 seconds for some of the panelists if they have a question to this point or a comment to maybe put into the chat before we move on?
That's perfect.
So if someone has a question or a comment about anything we've come to so far, please take a moment and type it in. We did have someone type in about the Great Depression, where the Great Depression fits in the new frameworks. It could be obviously taught as part of a modern U.S. history, the high school U.S. history that would go from about the 1890s further on. It would certainly, I would imagine, be, the participant also writes in about whether it be a civics or economics. Certainly, one of the things that the frameworks talk about is that even in every history class or geography class, that the other 3 disciplines be woven in. The Great Depression gives that incredible opportunity to do almost all 4 of the major disciplines as it's coming through. But where it would fit kind of in terms of the frameworks would probably most be specifically in the modern U.S. history at the high school level.
That's exactly right. In my school, we still teach, sorry, I couldn't tell if you could hear me. We still teach the modern U.S. history in the 8th grade, and we're looking over the next few years at whether or not there will be changes. I don't know to be sure.
Go ahead, Laura, pick it up.
Okay, I was checking to see if John had any other questions from the participants. But this is Laura Kranicki, and I'm going to talk about geography across the grade levels. And in this case, for the example we're going to use today, that dimension 3, the source, may be the same. However, in Dimension 2, the content or the disciplinary concepts will vary depending on the grade level. So you're going to notice on the screen here that there is a slide of 3 pages. On the left is grade 3, in the center is grade 5, and then on the right is grade 8. This is one of the pages, just a snapshot from Dimension 2. And in a moment, we're going to take a look at a map of Hartford for using the source. And if you look on the left on grade 3, I know the print is very small for you, and I don't know if you can see, but under grade 3, we have under the themes column, that's the one on the right where the arrow is pointing, you'll notice that it talks about patterns and causes of population development in Connecticut, towns and cities, or in what ways has our town in Connecticut changed and or stayed the same over time. And for the content side, it talks about the indigenous peoples of Connecticut. What are the histories of towns, landmarks, and geographical features, that are named after indigenous peoples in Connecticut, or the impact of geography on population patterns and economic development. Now again, we're going to be looking at a historical map of Hartford in that context. In the center image, the one that has grade 5 here talks about the role of Connecticut in U.S. history and exploring the history of individual Connecticut cities and towns. And then in addition, under the content side of that strand, there are examples of ways to incorporate Connecticut and town history. And lastly, just in this instance, on the last column in grade 8, this one talks about Connecticut and local connections, and there are 2 content areas. One is analyzing reasons for economic growth in Connecticut in the 19th century and ways that Connecticut contributed to the growth and expansion of the nation. In addition, it talks about evaluating the history of individual cities and towns in the 19th century and analyzing reasons for economic and or social change in individual towns during this period. Now, I know that you may not cover this historical map necessarily in grade 8, but it would serve as a historical basis of comparison to a 19th century map. Let's take a look at that map. It's on the next slide. It's a colonial map of Hartford. And I did give a link there in case you want to see another image of it. There's a downloadable image of it on teachitct.org. But the map is called the Map of Pioneer Hartford, founded 1636, incorporated 1784. And yet using a map like this one across multiple grade levels will produce different results. For example, a map like this can tell a lot about how things were in the past. And a question you may ask the students, if you were working for the state archaeologist, how could maps like this help in learning about Connecticut history? Using this map, where might you search for artifacts with clues to our past? Or you might talk about there are several Native American references on this map. Can you spot them? Several groups of Native peoples lived in the Hartford area, and they have a strong cultural heritage within our state. You'll also notice, as a teacher, how the map is oriented. And asking students to look at this, you can ask them which way is north. You might want to take a minute to see if you can figure out which way is north using this map. And how can you tell? Which way does the Connecticut River flow? You could ask students to look in different atlases or different maps to determine which direction other rivers flow, such as comparing to rivers like the Mississippi River, the Amazon River, or even the Nile River. Also, you might have students look at scale. This would be a good example of looking at scale on a map, or how important scale is on a map. If you were using this Pioneer map of Hartford, how close do things seem to each other? How might this be misleading if you were going to walk from Soldiers Field to Westfield? I know you're all looking to find Soldiers Field and Westfield on this map now. And then for a lower elementary student, you might ask them to consider using a map like this and thinking about mapping out their own neighborhood, or even a map that would take them from their house to their school. What things would be important to put on the map, and what things might you have to exclude? And as a comparison, let's take a look at the map on the next slide. The next slide shows a Hartford Settlement Map from 1636. You'll notice the map is oriented differently. You'll see the river in this one as a comparison. It also shows land plots with names of those living in the region. If this map was given to students in conjunction with a previous map, consider how students in different grade levels could evaluate them. Now, for example, let's think about grade 3. And one of the questions, the compelling questions for grade 3 is, in what ways has our town in Connecticut changed and or stayed the same over time? That's a grade 3 question. And you could use both this source and the previous source to have students analyze that. Or in grade 5, this is a supporting question from the frameworks. The question was, how did Indigenous peoples view the ownership of land? And how did that view differ from the colonists? Actually, this is a very good example. You can see plots of land, how they've been blocked out, and also the names that are there. Those names now correspond with neighborhoods that still exist in Hartford. And lastly, in grade 8, remember, this is a little bit out of the time range of grade 8. However, as background or as part of a progression of life in Connecticut, you can ask students to explore the history of individual Connecticut cities and towns, and maps such as this one can help you do this. And for even more comparisons, I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide. It shows a screenshot of the Yukon's Magic, which is the Map and Geographic Information Center. If you don't have this website bookmarked, definitely do it. They also do a lot of work for teachers, so if you're looking for a specific map, if you contact them, they're very accommodating and they will find that information for you. But this is a historical map, mashup map, and what that means is if you notice on the left side, it's a little hard to see, but on the left side of the map, there's a little drop-down toolbar. You'll see on the left it says 1640 Hartford, and then beneath that, there's some other maps. There's thank you for pointing that out, 1893 Hartford, an 1834 aerial shot, a 1990 aerial shot, a 2006 NAIP imagery, and then it goes down to 2008. So as time moves on, there's different levels of maps that you can lay on top of each other, and you can get more geographic data from that. This is a very powerful tool for students to use. And if you don't have GIS where you can do overlays, this is an excellent tool to use. And you can toggle back and forth, and they're also downloadable. Did you have a question?
Yeah, Laura, if you take a look in the chat, we see some ideas that one of our participants uses with colonial maps.
That's great. I don't see anything in the box, in the chat box. Could you tell us what that is?
Sure. It says, we ask the students, what is the central focus of old colonial maps? Most of the time it is the church. We then compare them to today's maps. What is the central focus of today's maps?
That's excellent. And then even with Google, there's a lot of opportunities for finding some of those buildings and those structures, but also comparing the neighborhoods, the names of streets, and the names of rivers. Why are they named the way they're named is an excellent extension of that geographic skill. And on the next slide, it talks about posing geographic challenges. Now, both Mary and Kate gave examples of geographic challenges in their discussions. And in this image, I have these are kids in my classroom looking at some images of water use and water scarcity. But students will go well beyond just maps in their inquiry. But they may serve as a starting point to determine the needs of a community or place. And then they also foster critical thinking. It's surprising when students start in an inquiry how often they will go to find a map or an atlas to see if they can support their information with geographic evidence. Are there any questions about this before we move on to the next slide? Okay, John. Oh, I have I have somebody here who talks about how they use kindergarten students, bring in maps from home, and they share and discuss how maps are used. That's excellent. I also think it's great when students bring them back when they travel. It gives them a perspective as well. Okay, I think then, John, if you'd like to take the next slide.
One of the things that we've seen over the course of our discussion about the frameworks and the implementation of inquiry as we've been going around different districts is some teachers are still a bit concerned that, well, this is all wonderful. You know, we love to have our students do inquiry, but to really, you know, especially for our better students who are going to be moving on to college, they need to be able to take notes. They really need to be able to have a mastery of a series of content and historical facts or geographical facts that they can recall and use, and that's what's going to help them do well as they move on to college or university work. That's really not the case. As university faculty, we're far more concerned about having students come to our classes with historical thinking skills than having them try to memorize a lot of things that they'll really forget by the 4th of July in any particular summer. When I teach my classes and when my colleagues teach classes at Central, we don't start with an assumption of a deep background or knowledge. When I teach my Vietnam War class, we go back to Vietnamese ancient history. I'm not expecting students to come in having a whole series of memorized facts about the Vietnam War or about Vietnamese history. And this is really becoming the trend across the discipline at the university level, even at the survey level classes. You know, when you remember when you went back to your U.S. history survey or your world history classes, the emphasis on just saying, here are a bunch of things that we need you to remember that I'm going to talk about and then have you spit back is really not the case anymore. And I think we see evidence, I see evidence of this every day in the classes at Central, talking with my colleagues across the country. And this is coming from a couple of different aspects. Sam Weinberg's work out of Stanford, if you're familiar with historical thinking and other unnatural acts and reading like an historian, that's had a tremendous influence on how university faculty are trying to think about our own classes as we move forward. Further piece of evidence that this is really happening is that all of the major journals of the Journal of American History, the Journal of the American Historical Association, now have specific teaching sections where they review websites, where they review monographs that are designed for undergraduate use, where they talk about different elements of teaching. This was really not the case even just 10 years ago as I was finishing grad school. So what brings about some of this? I think a lot of it is how academics began to work with the recent Teach American History grant programs. That process allowed college instructors to really see the value and the utility of inquiry as a way to reach students, as inquiry as a way to develop the historical thinking skills, which become so important. And we're seeing these articles, you know, this is what works for me now, this is what's happening in my classroom. That's being valued more and more in the journals, in the discussions of teaching. You know, just one example, in History Teacher, there was this recent article in February, Surveys, Curricula, and the Challenges of Global History, that really talked about inquiry and the need to incorporate the inquiry arc into what happens at the survey level. So if part of anyone's concern is that, you know, I'm losing content or I'm losing coverage by having students do too much inquiry, I would tell you not to worry about that at all. The more that students do this inquiry, work on these skills, they gain a deeper historical knowledge of the time period by working on the skills and by working on inquiry, and they retain it and they can use it, and they can use it in a much more flexible manner and have a deeper understanding than if it's simply trying to memorize things which don't get memorized because they don't see it as exciting or interesting in moving forward. So So what's happening in terms of what's happening in Connecticut, which I think is at the cutting edge of K through 12 education and social studies across the country, is really also happening at the college and university level. This is the best way to prepare students to be good thinkers, to be good writers, to prepare their arguments, to think historically, to think like a geographer, to think like a political scientist, and to prepare them to be citizens, which is our ultimate goal at all levels. It's all set, Steve.
I'll jump in here just to say if anyone has any questions and that they haven't asked, feel free to enter that into the chat box.
Could I ask you, could I just ask one, at the different levels that you find folks teach at, how much, when students are doing investigations or doing inquiry and they're acquiring sources, how much of that is done by a teacher or media specialist, and how much of it is it the responsibility of the students to access the sources that they need to do the research? I'd be curious to know at the different grades that you folks work with what the answer to that would be.
I can answer for grades. I work with teachers and children from kindergarten through 8th grade. I think there's some overlap between the three of us, but it really varies. So again, our kindergartners and first graders are going out and sometimes, or second graders, finding a pamphlet or interviewing somebody, or to find a map that they have around the house to bring in. So that's the kind of sources they're collecting at that grade level. However, we still provide quite a bit of a few of the sources, really curate those sources all the way up with sort of a gradual release to students in grades 6 through 8, creating that compelling question that might fit under another unit topical question, but then finding the sources, a book from a database, newspaper, whatever, to match that. So it's sort of gradually released throughout the years, but always allowing even our youngest children to be empowered to go out, that they can find sources that are going to answer their questions.
I'm going to jump in too, Mary, because you brought up a good point. And I also found that not only the sources that the teacher provides, that evaluating sources, which the dimension says, is a two-way street. The teacher also has to evaluate whether or not the sources are the material is useful for the needs of the student and for the level of the student, but also that if it's appropriate for the inquiry task. And then students themselves need a different school to evaluate source material for elements such as text features, author's craft, point of view, so on. And we found that if you just say to kids, go out and find a source, that could work two ways. It may be very useful. In other ways, it may not serve the purpose that the student needs. So depending on the level, guiding them toward finding appropriate sources for their inquiry may be necessary, especially for younger ones.
I'm going to chime in here too. This is Kate, and I totally agree with what Laura just said. And part of my purpose when I'm thinking about using these sources is that I want to model how I have found sources and discuss the limitations of a source. For example, FDR and his inauguration speech. Well, what was the purpose of his speech? And why did he choose to use those words? And then later, as my students develop their own inquiries, I want them to recall those same questions. If I'm using a website, what is the purpose of that website? And how do I know that I can believe what I'm finding at this particular site? The same can be said for a letter written during the American Revolution. What is the purpose of this letter? And who is the author? And what point of view are they sharing? I guess for me, I want to start by holding their hands, but then release them so that they can use these evaluative skills on their own to find their own sources.
Could
I can, would you like me to jump in on the differentiation comment? Yeah, we have one of our participants has spoken about in the chat box about differentiation, and that's certainly a challenge that I know we all face and our colleagues definitely face. I think for primary sources, not being afraid to chunk some of the material and help guide kids through, even if it's an excerpt, is really helpful. Kate did a wonderful job of showing how she was giving some of the vocabulary words in the right-hand column to her students that are a little bit older. Having students jump in and outline or highlight key words is really important, but it is a challenge, and I think it's one that's not going to go away, that we need to allow kids to use robust primary sources in addition to at their own level. But there are definitely different ways to do it. This might actually be something that if we have participants that have some expertise, feel free to jump in the chat here.
I want to jump in and say that I really agree with what Mary just said. And one of the things when I've got a primary source, I put it through Microsoft Word and I just check the readability level. And for me, I start by trying to adapt the source just slightly so that it's a little bit ahead of my students. So in the beginning of 8th grade, I might choose a solid 8th grade source or a 9th grade level source. I always read it aloud first so that there is an auditory connection, which sometimes helps students. But ultimately, if you're going to get to independence, students independently able to access and understand a source, then it really needs to be on the student's level. And those are usually shorter pieces.
There are a couple of databases also. I know our school system has purchased something for Britannica online, and there's ways that you can, if students have their own question and they're going to do more independent or guided research, that they can self-select a level of information. Another source that you may already be familiar with is Expert Space. I think it's put out by Grolier, which is, again, a database type system where kids, based on their lifestyle, students can self-select the reading level of their passage. So those are some ways that even with a student-selected question, they can go about and do a little more independent or guided research.
And there's a wonderful resource online called News ELA that allows you to select reading levels from elementary through high school, actually, for various current events. I also noticed that somebody mentioned that images are a great tool, and maps and images and political cartoons are wonderful resources for reaching students who may not all be on the same reading level.
Could I ask another quick question? Almost everybody who talks about inquiry talks about the collaborative nature for inquiry, but I've had teachers ask, is it when you're doing an inquiry activity or during the inquiry process in your classrooms, is it all collaborative, or are there places where individual students do individual work?
I will start to answer. I do a combination. If I've got a difficult resource, then it's whole class instruction at the beginning. Then I want students to work in small groups to puzzle out some of the dilemmas. But ultimately, my assessment needs to be individual for the students. So within any one unit, I'll start whole class, I'll move to small group, and then if I've done it well, the students will be able to independently solve the issues at the end of the unit.
And this is Laura again. I think it depends on the task. Sometimes students find that working independently for certain tasks can get them to a point where they have the background knowledge, at least they do some of the inquiry independently, And then when they come back, they have a different point of view or a different perspective, perhaps, than to share either in a large group or a small group or a whole class. It depends on the task. And I think it depends on the student, too. You'll also find that even when you leave the room and the kids are still thinking about what they've been working on, that they may just go ahead and do some research on their own and find out much more that may have not been a plan of for us originally, but then it adds to the enrichment of the inquiry.
Yeah, just to jump in here, especially in elementary, we have tried to reformat our units to really have compelling questions as the whole unit, that we're all in this together. This is the question we're going to try to answer, and we use that QFT and come up with different kinds of supporting questions and other compelling questions to lead our class inquiry. And then typically within our units at the elementary level, we also then have those spots for either small group inquiry or even individual inquiry, where a student might take a question and really run with it, depending on the age level.
Ladies, do you want to take us through some resources?
Yes, that would be great. And in fact, some of the ones that have been mentioned will be ones that will come up on the next slide as well. I'll start with this, and just for the participants who are joining us, we put these resources together for you to provide not only materials that may be primary sources, but may also be things that will link you to other digital resources, newspapers, articles, images, museums, Connecticut connections, etc. There's ideas for teachers, you as a teacher. There are examples of inquiry. There's professional development for educators. There's articles with multiple perspectives on various topics. And there are geographic and global resources here. I have it set up as a live binder. And those of you who have used this before, you'll find it's a great resource. It's a little hard to tell because it's on the side there, and the main page of my binder has the framework. But just to the left of it, you'll see these little rectangles that are in different colors, in blues and greens. And there's a red and yellow one as well. But if you click on those, it's just like a regular binder. And this is not clickable. This is just a screenshot for this purpose. But if you click on those, additional pages will come up just like it would be in a regular binder. But to make it easy to find for future, I put it on ctsocialstudies.blogspot.com, and there's a link directly there that have the resources in it. There's hundreds of links in this binder, but for today's purpose, we're just going to share a few of them. And I'm really glad that, John, when you mentioned that content comes from being flexible, I think this is a perfect example. I think teachers are at a point right now, and even students are trying to find materials that will be useful and flexible in their classrooms. And so I'm going to point out a few just to highlight them for the participants today. And if you have questions about them, or if you do have a resource that you would like us to add to this collection, please put them in the chat on the side, and we will put those into the binder. The first source I wanted to just briefly talk about is relatively new. It's teachitct.org. I mentioned it earlier. It's a crowdsourced website through the Connecticut Humanities that provides inquiry activities for primary source documents in Connecticut and U.S. history. Teachers like you may contribute to the site with inquiries on primary sources. And if you go onto the teachitct.org website, there is a tab in the upper corner that is to add an activity. If you're interested in creating inquiry but don't know where to find a Connecticut primary source, this binder also contains a link to digitized collections through the Connecticut Historical Society and other local museums. And that's Teach It. In addition, and some of you may have used this next one, is iEarn.org. iEarn is the International Education and Resource Network. And if you're looking to collaborate with students on cooperative projects and globally on project-based learning, this is the site to use. And just briefly, the next one's museum is a news museum in Washington, D.C., but the best part of their website is something called Today's Front Pages, and it links to the front page of newspapers from between, I think, 800 to 1,000 newspapers every day. So if you're asking students to look at multiple perspectives on a news event, a newsworthy event, that would be an excellent source. And lastly, we have the Library of Congress, which, as you know, has thousands of documents, images, even sound recordings and films now including maps and high-quality digital scans that can be used in the classroom. And those are all downloadable. And lastly for today, the Connecticut Geographic Alliance is located in Connecticut. It's affiliated with National Geographic, and they have a lot of mapping materials and resources for geography in the classroom. And I know Kate has also a link of research and resources that we did put that page on the binder as well, so you can find them all in one place. I don't know if Kate, if you have something you want to mention about that?
I just wanted to say thank you, Laura. My website is really kind of my own journey as our teaching has changed, both with the Common Core and with the C3 and now with our Connecticut frameworks. There's two sources I really wanted to point out that are wonderful. One is called C3 Teachers. It is a wonderful source for inquiry from around the United States. It includes a template for making your own inquiry. For me, it reminds me to remember Dimension 3. And it also includes an IDM generator, which is a place to publish your own inquiry and see other people's inquiry. That's c3teachers.org. And then another wonderful source is the Stanford History Education Group. They have an extraordinary collection of primary sources which can be adapted for grade levels, and they also have wonderful introductory activities on Dimension 3, really, on evaluation of sources and on different perspectives. So those are my resources that I wanted to recommend to everyone.
I think this is Mary. I think we're just about out of time here, but here's a few American history favorites.
You're two to do this. Take a time. Take a couple minutes.
Okay. I just wanted to give a shout out for, I guess I'm down in Fairfield County, so Gilder Lehrman in New York City is about as far away as it's closer than Hartford is to us. The Institute has many wonderful resources for K-12 teachers. In addition, your school can become an affiliate member, and it's free and entitles your school to many benefits, including some free summer seminars, which are among the best professional learning I think that you can go to, especially for American history. I've personally used many of their sources, and just a few top favorites. There's one that you may not be familiar with that connects geography and history, those two disciplines. And it's out of the University of Richmond. It's the Atlas of Historical Geography of the United States. And I really recommend that from, fifth grade, wonderful source for fifth grade, where students can really see the impact of colonization based on the geography. The Valley of Shadow, if you're doing something with the Civil War, that's a wonderful site. A little bit, it's got a retro feel to it. It's an older site, but it zooms in on a town in the north and one in the south and brings together multiple resources from newspapers to data to maps to create a composite sketch of those towns. And you could use it as is, I could see in 8th grade, but if you're going further in high school, there may even be some places where your students could actually create their own town profile using sources from Connecticut. You probably are familiar with Docs Teach from the National Archives, very easy to use and very searchable. And then the Gilder Lehrman site itself has a tremendous amount of resources, especially on Lincoln and the 19th century. That's it. I see that we've gotten a couple others that participants have been chatting about. See if I can pull a couple of them. 100people.org for geographical global issues. That's a new one for me. I'll have to check that one out. And Beyond the Bubble. Yes, as we move our way to, you've got your DBQ. How do you make sure that kids have those skills before they get there in some of the teaching? There's some wonderful ways to have our students touch base in some of those. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
This was, to me, a very enjoyable and a very interesting session today. We will be back. Thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you to all of the participants. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and the next session will be on Dimension 4 with a focus on taking informed action, which should be very interesting. So hopefully we'll see everybody back in 2 weeks. And again, thank you for the presenters. Have a good afternoon.